They were married to monsters, living in mansions, dining with Hitler, and raising children under Nazi flags. But when the war ended, their stories didn't. Some vanished, some lied, and some still believed. This is the shocking truth about what really happened to the Nazi wives after World War II. When we talk about the Nazis, we picture men in uniforms, Hitler, Himmler, Göring, Goebbels. But behind them stood women who weren't just silent bystanders. They were wives, mothers, and sometimes fanatics, living in luxury, raising families, and fully believing in Hitler's twisted vision. These women shared dinner tables with war criminals. They walked through gardens built with stolen labor. Some wrote love letters filled with hate. Others quietly rebuilt their lives after the Third Reich fell, hoping no one would remember their past. Were they victims of their husband's power or willing participants in a nightmare? That question haunts history. When the war ended in 1945, the world focused on capturing Nazi leaders. But what happened to the women who shared their homes, their beds, and often their ideology? Some were arrested, most were never charged. A few begged for forgiveness, but many stayed loyal to the bitter end. Their stories are rarely told, but they reveal a darker, more uncomfortable truth. Evil doesn't always wear a uniform. In this video, we'll uncover the hidden lives of Nazi wives and reveal what became of them when the Reich collapsed. What did they know? What did they do? And why were so many never held accountable? Chapter 1. The Banality of Loyalty. Margarete Himmler and Gerda Bormann. Evil doesn't always come wrapped in violence. Sometimes it arrives quietly, dressed in modest clothes, serving dinner, caring for children, smiling politely in group photographs. It speaks softly, with perfect manners, and a calm sense of duty. And yet it lives comfortably beside horror. That's the story of Margarete Himmler and Gerda Bormann. Two women who didn't just witness the rise and fall of Nazi Germany, but lived at the very center of its machinery. They weren't anonymous bystanders. They were wives, mothers, and in their own way, believers. Margarete Himmler was born into a respectable German family and trained as a nurse. That background gave her an image of compassion, but the truth beneath was something else entirely. When she married Heinrich Himmler in 1928, he was still rising through the ranks of the Nazi Party. She stood by him as he evolved from a fringe political agitator into the head of the SS, the man most responsible for engineering the Holocaust. She was not dragged along against her will. She followed and often led with unwavering conviction. Early on, she embraced Nazi ideology as a guiding moral force. She didn't just tolerate her husband's role in the regime. She was proud of it. Her personal writings, uncovered years after the war, stripped away any illusion of innocence. In letters and diary entries, Margarete referred to Jews as unpleasant and greedy, echoing the dehumanizing rhetoric of the regime with chilling casualness. She described Nazi rallies with admiration, calling them powerful and beautiful. Her tone was not one of fear or compliance, but of celebration. She was deeply embedded in the culture of the Reich, not just through her marriage, but through her beliefs. At their home in Gmund, the Himmlers lived a life of comfort that stood in stark contrast to the suffering their regime inflicted. The estate was expansive and well kept, run with the help of domestic labor that in some cases was forced or coerced. The property symbolized the rewards of loyalty to the Third Reich. As Heinrich oversaw the construction of death camps and the logistics of genocide, Margarete managed the domestic front, a sphere no less ideological, no less complicit. She hosted parties for SS officers and their wives. She raised their daughter Gudrun with strict adherence to Nazi ideals, teaching her that her father was a great man and that Germany was destined to rule. Gudrun would grow up idolizing her father even after learning the full extent of his crimes. She never disavowed him. After Germany's surrender in 1945, the Allied powers were determined to bring the architects of Nazism to justice. Heinrich Himmler, attempting to escape under a false identity, was captured by the British and committed suicide before he could be interrogated. Margarete, however, was arrested, held in internment, and later released without charge. She denied knowledge of her husband's crimes. She insisted she had only been a housewife, a mother, a loyal German. But her writings told a different story, one of proud anti-Semitism, open support for the war, and quiet enjoyment of the regime's rewards. Gerda Bormann offers another kind of portrait, one even more zealous, even more disturbing. She wasn't merely supportive of her husband's position. She was a devout and fanatical Nazi in her own right. Married to Martin Bormann, Hitler's ruthless private secretary, Gerda lived at the very core of Hitler's inner circle. Her life was filled with access, influence, and privilege. The Bormanns lived near the Berghof, Hitler's private mountain retreat, where high-ranking officials and their families gathered in grotesque luxury, surrounded by looted art and the spoils of conquest. For Gerda, this life wasn't just comfortable, it was righteous. She raised 10 children in this environment, building a home around the cult of Hitler. Inside their house, portraits of the Führer hung alongside family photos. The children were taught to call Hitler Uncle Adolf, and their birthdays were sometimes acknowledged with handwritten cards from the man himself. Nazi flags adorned the nursery. Their education was steeped in racial superiority, obedience, and nationalist mythology. And Gerda reinforced it all, not out of obligation, but from deep belief. She saw Nazism not as a political regime, but as a divine mission. The letters she wrote to Martin throughout the war are perhaps the most haunting pieces of evidence we have about her state of mind. In them, she refers to Jews as vermin and celebrates their exclusion and extermination. She calls the war a sacred duty and expresses disgust at any sign of weakness or compromise. Her tone is not hysterical, it's rational, composed, frighteningly sincere. She believed in the Nazi vision down to her bones, even as the war turned against Germany. Even as cities crumbled and bodies piled up, Gerda remained committed to the end. That end came quickly and quietly. Martin Bormann vanished during the Battle of Berlin in May 1945. For decades, his fate was uncertain, until his remains were finally identified in the 1970s. Gerda didn't live long enough to see that chapter close. She died of cancer in 1946 at the age of just 36. Before her death, she placed her children in a Catholic convent. Her letters, however, survived. They are chilling not just for what they say, but for the clarity with which they say it. There is no remorse, no reconsideration, just the cold certainty of a person who believes they were on the right side of history, even as history collapsed around them. Both Margarete Himmler and Gerda Bormann lived lives of extraordinary privilege, built atop unfathomable suffering. They occupied a unique position, close enough to power to see the truth, but protected enough to avoid the consequences. Neither of them fired a weapon. Neither of them stood trial. But the system could not have functioned without them. They provided the emotional labor, the domestic stability, the ideological continuity that helped normalize atrocity. They made genocide feel like family life. When we ask what they knew, the answer is uncomfortably clear. They knew everything that mattered. They saw the rewards of theft, the absence of neighbors, the rise of terror, and they never turned away. In fact, they leaned in. They enjoyed the silence that comes when dissent is crushed. They watched as their children played under swastikas, while entire populations vanished from the streets. And in the quiet moments, over tea, over letters, over lullabies, they reinforced the lie that this was all for the greater good. Their stories unravel the comfortable myth that the women of the Third Reich were innocent, passive, or manipulated. These were not sheltered wives with no agency. They were political actors in their own right. They didn't simply go along with evil. They believed in it, nourished it, and passed it on to their children. They remind us that violence doesn't always look like a gunshot. Sometimes it looks like a mother's bedtime story, a carefully set table, or a letter sealed with a kiss. Justice for them was elusive. Margarete Himmler returned to civilian life largely undisturbed. Gerda Bormann died before she could be held to account. Their names are footnotes in the biographies of powerful men, but their lives tell a story that demands more than passing mention. They are proof that the machinery of totalitarianism doesn't run on speeches alone. It runs on belief, on comfort, on the willing participation of those who stand behind the curtain, smiling, serving, agreeing. As we turn to the next story, we meet a woman who didn't just embrace her elite status, she flaunted it. Emmy Göring, the glamorous wife of Hermann Göring, wasn't content to stand in the background. She made herself the face of Nazi high society, living in opulence built on looted wealth. And long after the war, she refused to apologize for any of it. Chapter 2, Luxury and Denial, Emmy Göring. But that's not all. If Margarete Himmler and Gerda Bormann represented the quiet banality of loyalty, women who clung to ideology behind closed doors, then Emmy Göring was something else entirely. She was loyalty dressed in diamonds. She didn't just believe in the Reich, she embodied its performance. While the Himmlers raised their children in racial purity and Gerda Bormann filled letters with venom, Emmy Göring floated above it all, swathed in furs, smiling for cameras, dining with Hitler, and living in stolen splendor. She was the Reich's socialite queen, the public-facing glamour of Nazi power. Where others hid their ideology behind domestic roles or private correspondence, Emmy wore hers like a costume, parading through war-torn Germany as if the Reich were her stage and she its star. Her life was theater, grand, curated, and meticulously detached from the horror unfolding outside her estate gates. Born Emma Sonnemann in 1893, Emmy was a successful stage actress before she met Hermann Göring, one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany. He was a war hero from World War I, an early Nazi loyalist, and the head of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. Their marriage in 1935 was more spectacle than ceremony. Hitler attended. Photographers swarmed. It wasn't just a wedding, it was political theater. And Emmy played her role with polished precision. Hitler adored her. He referred to her as the First Lady of the Third Reich before Eva Braun was ever publicly acknowledged. She was everything the Nazi regime wanted to showcase to the world. Elegant, poised, maternal, and loyal. Her image was curated to inspire admiration among German women and quiet envy abroad. But beneath that carefully constructed image was a woman who lived in opulence while the regime committed some of the worst crimes in modern history, and she never once looked away. The Göring's home, Karen Hall, was a sprawling estate in the woods outside Berlin. It was named after Göring's first wife, but its soul belonged to Emmy. The estate was filled with art and furniture looted from Jewish families in occupied territories. Paintings by old masters hung on the walls, priceless rugs stretched across polished floors, their tableware, their chandeliers, their silver-framed portraits, nearly all of it was stolen. Karen Hall wasn't just a house, it was a monument to what the Nazis had taken, wrapped in the illusion of aristocratic grace. Emmy presided over it all like a queen. She threw elaborate parties attended by high-ranking Nazis. While the Luftwaffe bombed London and Warsaw, champagne flowed in the Göring dining room. As Jews were rounded up and deported, Emmy selected dresses from her vast wardrobe and jewelry from her private collection, many of the items taken directly from victims of the Holocaust. Her staff included forced laborers. She knew what powered her lifestyle, and yet, like so many around Hitler, she pretended not to see, or perhaps she never pretended. Perhaps she simply didn't care. The war didn't touch her the way it touched ordinary Germans. She gave birth to her daughter Edda in 1938, an event that was celebrated across the Reich. Hitler became the child's godfather. Photos of Emmy holding Edda were widely published, painting a soft maternal portrait of the regime's inner circle. For Nazi propaganda, it was a gold mine. The charming, dignified wife of a top official, now a mother to a child raised in Hitler's orbit. But as Germany's military fortunes collapsed, so too did Emmy's bubble of privilege. Allied forces moved in. Göring, once Hitler's right-hand man, had become increasingly sidelined. His erratic behavior, morphine addiction, and power plays irritated Hitler. In the final days of the war, Göring was arrested by SS troops on Hitler's orders, then captured by American forces. Emmy fled with her daughter as the Reich disintegrated. Karen Hall was blown up on Göring's orders to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. The treasures it had held were lost or scattered. Many never recovered. The fantasy was over. After the war, Emmy was arrested by Allied authorities. She didn't go on trial in Nuremberg like her husband, but she wasn't entirely let off the hook either. She was labeled a major offender in the denazification courts and sentenced to 1 year in a labor camp. Her property was confiscated and her once royal status was stripped away. She emerged from prison poorer, older, but unchanged in her beliefs. She never condemned the Nazi regime, never publicly apologized, never accepted the depth of its crimes. In interviews years later, she painted herself as a misunderstood figure, gracious, loyal, and above all, innocent. She claimed ignorance of the Holocaust and insisted her lifestyle had been modest. She even defended her husband, calling him a good man who had tried to protect Germany. In her eyes, the war had simply gone wrong. The Allies had been too cruel. History had judged too harshly. Her daughter, Edda Göring, carried that torch well into adulthood. She defended both her parents, particularly her father. In later interviews, she denied that he bore responsibility for the Holocaust, painting him instead as a scapegoat and visionary. The Göring legacy, for both mother and daughter, became one of willful blindness, of rewriting memory into something more palatable, of refusing to look directly at the horror they had helped sustain. What makes Emmy Göring's story so striking isn't just the excess or the denial. It's the contrast. While millions were starved, beaten, deported, and murdered, she lived in furs and sipped fine wine beside stolen masterpieces. She was, in many ways, the ultimate expression of Nazi decadence, the illusion of civility wrapped around a core of unimaginable cruelty. She was never physically violent. She never issued orders. But Emmy didn't have to kill to be complicit. She cheered for the killers. She admired the architects of genocide. She helped elevate the regime's image, giving it a feminine, elegant face. And when it fell, she clung to the myth of its greatness like a family heirloom. Even in defeat, she remained defiant. She lived for decades after the war, surviving her husband and many of her contemporaries. She granted interviews, entertained sympathizers, and never once expressed real regret. Her denial became a shield, and for many Germans rebuilding their lives in the post-war years, she was a symbol of the reckoning that never truly came. Because Emmy Göring wasn't alone. There were hundreds, thousands of wives, mothers, and daughters who supported the regime, lived comfortably within it, and escaped judgment when it ended. The world turned its attention to the men at the top. The women who had stood beside them, benefited with them, often disappeared into the shadows of history. Emmy Göring didn't disappear. She posed. She smiled. She insisted she had done nothing wrong, and for the most part, the world let her. So now, we leave the gilded halls and descend into the darkness of the Führerbunker, where Eva Braun made the final, fatal choice to follow Hitler to the grave. But who was she, really? A passive lover caught in history's storm? Or the quiet, complicit heart of the Reich's most terrifying dream? Chapter 3, The Ghost of the Führerbunker, Eva Braun. But if Emmy Göring lived the Nazi fantasy on the surface, in pearls and public adoration, then Eva Braun lived it in the shadows. Her life was not marked by public speeches or political ambition. It was marked by waiting for Hitler to call, waiting to be seen, waiting to matter. While Emmy stood at banquets, Eva spent years just outside the camera's frame, part of the scenery, yet hauntingly close to the center of power. Her role was quieter, but no less disturbing, because while the world burned, she stayed. By the end of the war, she would become the woman who died beside Adolf Hitler. But her story began long before the bunker, and her presence inside the regime was no accident. Eva Braun was just 17 when she met Hitler in 1929. He was 40. She worked as an assistant and model for Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's official photographer, and that's where the connection began. Over time, their relationship deepened, not just romantically, but logistically. She moved into a house close to Hitler's Munich apartment. She was not his wife, not officially, but she lived like one. She kept his schedule, waited for him during long absences, and remained obsessively devoted, even as he kept her at arm's length from public view. For years, the public didn't even know she existed. Hitler cultivated an image of total dedication to Germany. A wife or even a girlfriend would have complicated that. So Eva Braun became the silent woman behind the Führer, her presence denied and minimized. She rarely appeared in propaganda. She wasn't allowed to sit with the men at high-level meetings, but she was always nearby, at Obersalzberg, in the Berghof, in the alpine sunshine of Hitler's private life. In private reels and candid photographs, she dances, swims, and laughs, seemingly untouched by the war her partner had unleashed. Those home movies are eerie to watch now. Eva twirling in snow-covered gardens while millions were being marched to death. Her detachment wasn't ignorance, it was a choice. She knew who he was. She had been with Hitler during the night of the long knives. She was by his side through Kristallnacht. She read the papers. She heard the speeches. She saw the gifts, the medals, the uniforms. She lived in a world fueled by theft, genocide, and dictatorship. Her holidays were spent in mansions, looted from murdered families. Her clothing, her cosmetics, her furniture, nearly all of it came from the spoils of war and extermination. And yet, she chose to remain. Some have tried to cast her as a naive girl caught in the tide of history. But Eva Braun was not a passive ornament. Her diaries, though sparse, show that she knew more than she ever admitted. She complained about being kept out of the limelight, about how Hitler prioritized his work over her. She wasn't protesting the policies or the war. She was upset about being excluded from it. She wanted to be included, even if it meant being part of a machine built on murder. To Hitler, she represented something else entirely. She was his escape, his illusion of normalcy. In a world of constant calculation and cold ideology, Eva was softness, youth, and adoration. She gave him a domestic fantasy without the messiness of a political wife. She never challenged him, never corrected him, never disobeyed. In that sense, she was the perfect partner for a man like Hitler. Loyal without demand, present without power, a mirror who only reflected what he wanted to see. But as the war turned against Germany, even Eva's secluded world began to collapse. Allied forces pushed from the west. Soviet troops closed in from the east. Hitler retreated to the underground Führerbunker in Berlin, and Eva followed. In April 1945, with Berlin in ruins and the Third Reich days from destruction, Eva Braun made her final decision. She could have fled. She could have vanished into the chaos and tried to start a new life. She had no public persona, no official title. Disappearing would have been easy, but instead, she packed her bags, slipped through collapsing lines, and entered the bunker. She chose death. There, in the dim concrete tunnels beneath Berlin, she married Hitler on April 29, 1945. It was a short, grim ceremony. He was pale and shaking. She wore a simple dress. They signed a marriage license. They toasted with cheap champagne. And the next day, they were both dead. Hitler swallowed cyanide and shot himself. Eva took cyanide. She was 33 years old. Their bodies were burned in a shallow crater outside the bunker as the Soviets advanced. Their ashes were scattered and reburied several times before being lost entirely. Eva Braun had wanted to die with Hitler, and she did, but her loyalty didn't make her a martyr. It made her a believer. What makes Eva Braun so haunting is not what she did, but what she refused to do. She never spoke out, never asked questions, never left. In a regime full of monsters, she wasn't a torturer or a bureaucrat. She was something else, the person who watches, smiles, and stays silent. The person who sees enough to know and not enough to care. She represents a different kind of complicity, the kind that wears a swimsuit by the lake while death trains pass through the countryside, the kind that eats well and laughs and dances while Europe is on fire, the kind that loves the man responsible for it all and still believes she's innocent. After the war, her name was erased from public discussion for years. She wasn't mentioned in most history books. Survivors didn't talk about her. Even the Nazis in exile and shame rarely invoked her. She had been invisible in life, and so she remained in death. But in recent decades, historians have begun to re-examine her story, piecing together diaries, photographs, and fragments of memory. And what emerges is chilling. Eva Braun wasn't simply Hitler's girlfriend. She was the quiet ideal of Nazi femininity, loyal, apolitical, beautiful, obedient. She was the embodiment of the private sphere the Nazis tried to preserve, where women supported from the sidelines, kept their homes in order, and asked no questions. Her death in the bunker wasn't just personal. It was symbolic. A regime that treated women as secondary figures ended with one dying beside its architect, nameless in the fire. Even today, Eva Braun forces uncomfortable questions. How do we judge someone who didn't kill but chose to stand beside the killer? Is love an excuse? Is silence a shield? Does devotion erase responsibility or reveal it? The answer is in the pattern we've seen before: complicity through comfort, belief without action, support without shame. Eva Braun, like Margarete Himmler, like Gerda Bormann, like Emmy Göring, shows us that evil isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just someone sitting at the edge of the abyss, pretending not to see. And now we meet the woman who refused to pretend. Magda Goebbels, who followed Hitler not just into death, but into the depths of absolute devotion. A woman who believed so deeply in the Nazi vision that she murdered her own children rather than live in a world without it. Chapter 4. The Mother of the Reich, Magda Goebbels. Among all the women tied to the Nazi regime, none went as far as Magda Goebbels. She didn't try to escape, deny, or distance herself from the Reich. She embraced it fully. Where others turned away at the end, Magda walked straight into the fire, with her eyes wide open and her children by her side. She wasn't raised in hate, born into comfort and privilege. Magda's early life unfolded in the salons of Brussels and Berlin. Educated, elegant, and fluent in social codes, she moved easily among Europe's elite. At one point, she was even romantically involved with a young Zionist intellectual. Her path into Nazism was not inevitable. It was chosen. That choice came into sharp focus when she married Joseph Goebbels in 1931. He was rising fast, Hitler's favorite propagandist, soon to become the voice of the regime, and Magda saw the opportunity. She wasn't just marrying into power. She was aligning herself with a worldview that promised purity, order, and a place at the center of history. She welcomed it. Magda played her role to perfection. She became the elegant face of Nazi womanhood, poised, photogenic, the ideal German wife and mother. Her blonde children smiled from propaganda films. Her home hosted Hitler himself. Her image reassured the public that everything the Reich was doing, no matter how brutal, had a moral and maternal soul behind it. But she was more than just symbolic. Magda wasn't faking loyalty to impress her husband. Her personal writings show real belief. She wrote about Hitler with reverence. She saw him not as a politician, but as a savior. In private letters, she said, "He has taken my heart completely." Her devotion to him was emotional, even spiritual. Germany might have been falling apart, but to her, the Reich was still sacred. Her children were raised deep inside that ideology. They called Hitler Uncle Adolf. Their rooms bore swastikas. They visited Obersalzberg, playing in the garden while the war machine ground on behind closed doors. This wasn't a double life. It was a single, unified one. Family life and fascism coexisted seamlessly. As the war neared its end and Berlin began to crumble under Soviet bombardment, Magda made a decision that stunned even those closest to her. Rather than leave or surrender, she brought her 6 children with her into the Führerbunker. She understood the war was lost, but in her mind, there was no life beyond the Reich worth living. After Hitler's suicide on April 30th, 1945, Magda acted with terrifying clarity. She believed that without National Socialism, her children had no future, not just politically, but spiritually. She saw the collapse of the Reich not just as a defeat, but as the death of a holy cause. And she couldn't imagine her children growing up in a world where that cause was buried in shame. That night, she dressed them in white nightgowns, brushed their hair, and gave them sleeping pills. Once they were unconscious, she placed cyanide capsules between their teeth. One by one, she ended their lives with the help of an SS doctor who had served the regime to its bitter end. There was no sign of panic, no last-minute plea for mercy. To Magda, this wasn't cruelty. It was devotion. She believed she was protecting them. In her mind, death was mercy compared to a life without Hitler. The next day, she and Joseph Goebbels walked outside into the broken ruins of Berlin. They took their own lives. Their bodies were set on fire, another act of ritual. But their children's corpses remained untouched, lying side by side underground until Soviet troops discovered them. The photos taken later are unbearable. 6 pale, perfect children, frozen in death. Not soldiers, not victims of bombs, victims of their mother's faith. Why did she go that far? Why take her children with her? The truth is chilling, because Magda believed the Reich was everything, and without it, life itself lost all meaning. Her love for her children was sincere, but it was conditional. It was love that obeyed ideology, love that sacrificed instead of protected. Her actions don't fit neatly into any familiar category. She wasn't passive. She wasn't manipulated. She wasn't insane. She was loyal to the end, to Hitler, to the cause, to the fantasy of a future that never came. After the war, Joseph Goebbels was remembered as the architect of propaganda, a dangerous and duplicitous man. But Magda's legacy became more complicated. Some called her a tragic figure, others a monster. But the truth is, she was neither a puppet nor a pawn. She was an agent of her own choices. She had a way out. She chose not to take it. Magda Goebbels forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth, that the most horrifying acts aren't always committed in anger. Sometimes they come from belief, from conviction, from the quiet, confident certainty that you're doing the right thing, even when what you're doing is unforgivable. She represents the final, awful destination of Nazi ideology when fully embraced. Not just militarism, not just genocide, but a total rewriting of what it means to be a mother, a wife, a human being. In her world, ideology came before everything, before country, before family, before her own children. She wasn't alone in her beliefs. Others, Margarete, Himmler, Gerda, Bormann, Emmy, Göring, shared in the system. But Magda took that loyalty to its extreme. She lived the ideal the regime demanded of women: obedience, sacrifice, and unwavering devotion. And she died by that same code. Now, as we move on, we shift focus from the inner circle to the countless women whose names history has tried to forget. The wives of SS officers, the female guards, the bureaucrats, and the ordinary housewives who supported and sustained a genocidal state. Most weren't in bunkers, most survived. Many simply vanished into post-war Europe. But their stories reveal just how far complicity can reach and how easily society chooses silence over justice. Chapter 5, Shadows of Justice. Ilse Hess and the Forgotten Wives. But Magda Goebbels wasn't the final thread in this disturbing tapestry. Her death was dramatic, yes, but it wasn't unique, because while some Nazi wives ended in fire or poison, many simply stepped into new lives after the war, their pasts trailing quietly behind them. They weren't on trial at Nuremberg. Most weren't interrogated. Some weren't even named. These were the forgotten women of the Third Reich, the ones who didn't become symbols of fanaticism, but lived deeply complicit lives all the same. Take Ilse Hess, the wife of Rudolf Hess, Hitler's longtime deputy. Unlike the wives who perished in the bunker, Ilse lived on for decades, educated and politically engaged. She was a fervent Nazi who believed in the party's mission from the beginning. When her husband flew solo to Scotland in 1941 to negotiate peace with Britain, a bizarre and unauthorized attempt that got him arrested, Ilse never distanced herself. She remained devoted publicly and privately, raising their son to believe his father was a martyr for the German cause. Ilse Hess never apologized, not for the war, not for the regime, not for the crimes. Instead, she gave interviews, defended Hitler's vision, and painted her husband as misunderstood. Her statements were polite, intellectual, and quietly chilling. She wasn't shouting in denial. She was calmly rewriting history. But Ilse was just one of many. Across Germany and Austria, Nazi wives re-entered civilian life with shocking ease. Some changed their names. Others moved back into towns that had once hailed their husbands as heroes. There were too many to investigate, and too little appetite for prolonged justice. The world was tired. The Allies needed to rebuild Europe, and for many, pursuing the wives of dead or imprisoned Nazis simply wasn't a priority. Yet evidence of complicity wasn't hard to find. Many of these women had lived in homes stolen from Jews. They'd worn looted jewelry, hosted dinner parties, while slave laborers starved outside their walls. They had benefited directly from genocide. Some requested forced laborers as housemaids. Others sent letters complaining about Jewish neighbors before those neighbors disappeared. Diaries, correspondence, and testimonies collected years later made it clear these women weren't ignorant. They had known enough to ask no questions and enjoy the rewards. And while a few women were held accountable, like Ilse Koch, the so-called Witch of Buchenwald, who was tried for her role in atrocities, they were the exception. Most, like Ilse Hess, were treated as unimportant. Their gender protected them from deeper scrutiny. The idea of women as secondary to power, as peripheral to politics, allowed many to walk free. But complicity doesn't require a uniform. Sometimes it looks like silence, like loyalty, like the kind of comfort that comes from not asking where your furniture came from or why the workers in your garden never speak. These women raised their children with Nazi values. Some even continued to spread propaganda in quiet ways, through memoirs, through private circles, through denial. And their stories remind us of something deeply uncomfortable, that evil isn't only loud or obvious. It can thrive in polite homes, in kitchens and nurseries, passed down with lullabies and photo albums. The wives of the Nazi elite weren't all monsters, but many were willing participants, and nearly all were spared real justice. In the end, the world looked at them and looked away. Their silence became our silence, and their survival became a warning that history doesn't always hold everyone accountable, even when it should. If this story moved you or made you think differently about history, let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more deep dives into the untold chapters of the past. Your support helps bring these difficult stories to light.